The night did not begin with searchlights or sirens. It began with a sound, thin, metallic, and far away, threading through the North Atlantic like a violin string drawn too tight. Below the surface, in a steel tube painted black and smelling of oil, a German hydrophone operator nudged his headset and tapped the dial. Bearings rose and fell. A distant beat of propellers, a pipe resonance like a church bell, a hollow knock riding the swell. In 1943, the ocean was a listening war. U-boats hunted by ear. Convoys lived or died by whether their steel sang in the water. On the surface, the wind ran hard from the northwest. Whitecaps slapped the freighter's rusted hull and blew sheets of spray across the deck load of crates lashed in hurry. In the galley, where steam curled from a pan of gray stew, a cook named Tommy Lawson held a ladle, felt the pot hum against its trivet, and frowned. The pot had a ring to it, sharp, fatiguing, the sort of ring a man learns to hate on a long watch. He shifted the trivet, nudged the pot into a shallow bath he'd splashed across the stovetop to keep drips from scorching, and like magic, the ring died. The ladle's handle still trembled, but the clang dropped into a dull, swallowed thud. He didn't have the language for it, mass loading, damping, impedance, but he had the proof in his bones. Water stole the voice of metal. By then he knew too much about voices. Night after night, when the cook's work slowed, Lawson would step to the lee side of the galley and listen to the ship talk. He felt the nerve buzz of the pump strokes in the deck plates under his soles, heard the piping rattle in the bulkhead, and, when he bent his head to the ladder well, caught the faint mailbox hum of the engine room, vowels of iron carrying through steel. Say what you will about ships, they are gossips. They carry every quarrel, every loose bolt, every vibration like a rumor down the frames and out into the brine. The U-boats weren't magicians. They were eavesdroppers, disciplined, patient, ears pressed to a world that never stops whispering. Lawson had never met a hydrophone, but he had met pots, griddles, ladles, and knocks. He had learned that a splash of water quiets a pan, that a wet rag under a cutting board kills the painful skitter, that a bucket at a certain angle will sit calm in a sea that should throw it. Water takes the chatter, he muttered to no one, and the ship ran on, a cold old beast with a pounding heart. The convoy zigzagged under blackout, a chessboard that moved and breathed. The commodore's signal lamp flickered instructions down the line, and the escort's sterns foamed in hard turns as they swept for wolves. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Murdoch bunched his shoulders against the vibration that came when the second pump picked up load. A bulkhead trembled in sympathetic rhythm. Thick steel, but singing like a blade if you knew how to listen. He'd tried the obvious, tightened clamps, repacked glands, braced a run of pipe with a chunk of timber cut like a wedge. The wedge helped for an hour, and then shifted, and the ringing returned. Top of the head ache, teeth on edge disgust, and, in Murdoch's private fear, a broadcast into the night. "They hear us," he said to the third engineer, then caught himself. Talking like that in front of the boys did no good. He signed the log, scowled at the rev counter, and thought about bearings, those invisible lines a man with a headset could draw through his boat, through the black water, into the soft body of a freighter. Lawson finished the last bowl, wiped his hands, and went looking for a listener. He found Murdoch in that sour steel cave of heat and roar. "Chief," he said, shy and stubborn at once, I think I can shut that bulkhead up." Murdoch gave a cook the look engineers save for outsiders. Lawson's eyes were honest, though, and the ship's hum made them both conspirators. "You can try anything that doesn't stop her heart," Murdoch said. "You screw with suction or cooling, and I'll put you back washing pans until New York." Lawson grinned. "I need canvas, and hose, and water." The chief barked a short, skeptical laugh. "Canvas we got, hose we got, water we're in." The next 10 minutes lived on trust that only war breeds. Men passed their rank and training, reaching for anything that might keep them alive long enough to see a gray dawn. They started at the noisiest culprit. A pipe run along a bulkhead shivered when the pump hit the top of its stroke. Every shiver jumped into the bulkhead like a shout. Lawson wrapped the pipe in a sleeve of canvas soaked in a bucket and tightened it with whatever he could find. Hose clamps, bits of line, a length of soft iron wire. He slid the sleeve along the run and listened with his teeth. Where the pipe crossed a bracket, the rattle tried to leap the gap. The water-heavy canvas soaked the energy and passed on only a sigh. Then he went for the bulkhead itself. He could not carve, weld, or reframe, but he could load the sheet with moving weight. He cut lengths of hose, clipped them to sluice points, and let water fill a series of shallow baffles. A staggered train of little bellies pressed against the steel, each sloshing mass a hand on the drum. The first fill made the bulkhead's voice drop an octave, a baritone now instead of a tenor. The second fill pushed that baritone into a mumble. Lawson set a hand on the plate and felt it still. The pump kept ticking, but its argument stopped spreading. Murdoch, who had seen too many snake oils and miracle cures, raised his eyebrows until the lines there met. He took his pencil from behind his ear, wrote, "Canvas sleeve on pump line, water-filled baffles on beach D, works," and underlined "works" because the engine room rarely delivered gifts. The cook wasn't done. He eyed the little plinth that carried the auxiliary pump and shook his head. "She's dancing," he said. "She's stepping on the floor, and the floor tells the whole ship." Murdoch's second wanted to say something about cooks and dancing, but the man had the grace to hold his tongue. Lawson cut another strip of canvas, soaked it, folded it thick, and slid it under one corner of the pump mount. The pump found a new footing, and, to anyone without an ear for it, sounded exactly the same. To Murdoch, the difference was not noise level, but the poison hidden in the noise. The 20-cycle drumbeat that traveled across the deck plates softened, as if a muscle clenched in the ship had let go. On the next watch, when the sea had turned from slate to ink, and the escort's wake glowed faintly, Murdoch and Lawson climbed to the wheelhouse with a request. The helmsman looked like a statue gone tired. The skipper, a man who had learned to measure life in guesses, stood with one hand hooked under the chart table. "We want to try a thing with a prop," Murdoch said. He explained in plain words, cavitation tones, vibration bands, the ugly resonance that lived at a certain RPM where the blades chewed water wrong and sang into the night. "We can shift a few percent," he said. "She'll go near the same speed, but we might slide off the loud ridge." The skipper studied the sea seam where darkness met darker. "Do it," he said. On the rev counter, the needle dropped a hair. The ship's thrum changed, not quieter, exactly, but less articulate. Fewer sharp letters in the water's alphabet. Lawson stared through glass that reflected him back like a ghost, and listened, as if he could hear through hull and water clear to the bottom of the world. A U-boat 30 miles down Moon was doing its own listening. In the tiny, damp kingdom of the sound room, the operator spun the wheel of the bearing table and called out lines for the plotting party. He knew the music of cargo ships. He knew the beat that meant 3-blade propellers biting clean and the high, rasping reek of cavitation, bubbles ripping free and collapsing with violence men could feel in their bones. Tonight the usual patterns slipped. A bearing that should have sharpened as the convoy waltzed through its zigzag instead blurred. A harmonic he relied on to pin speed and distance sagged as if someone had put a hand on a bell. He frowned at the slate. The captain came once, twice, and put a finger on the grease pencil marks, his mind a machine that ate angles and excreted torpedo shots. "Again," he said. The operator listened until patience chafed and heard only the steady, stupid hush of the Atlantic talking to itself. The payoff was not fireworks. It was absence. No sudden, clean torpedo track. No escort exploding into flares and depth charges. No hot smell of burning paint and spilled kerosene. No wake emptying of men into a cradle of ice. On the morning log, the radio officer wrote, "Hydrophone bearings intermittent overnight. Escorts report lost contact twice." On the engine room sheet, Murdoch added, "Noise signature appears reduced. Effects strongest at 135–145 RPM. Tank baffles full. Canvas sleeve maintained wet." Lawson, in the galley at dawn, poured coffee that tasted like a promise and felt a kind of fear he had not yet known. The fear that what he had done might matter wide and long, that he might be called to explain a trick he had no schooling for. "It's kitchen sense," he told the messman. "You put water in something and it stops talking." The messman, who had never been asked to save the Atlantic, nodded. "Well, keep it wet," he said. When they docked and took a breath that wasn't the North Atlantic's, the talk went its normal way. Pay, replacements, a week's respite that would turn to 3 days by the time the papers were done. But the chief engineers gathered in the sticky back room of a chandlery and traded notes like men swapping cards. One had tried sandbags. The sand held, but the canvas rotted fast, and the grit got everywhere. One had rigged a wooden grid against a bulkhead and filled the gaps with wet sawdust, which stank and settled, and that made the bracketed pipe worse until he rotated the grid through 90 degrees and tied it like a raft. They wouldn't put any of this in a peer-reviewed journal. They put it in a 1-page sheet written with the plain bossiness of men who do not have time for theory. "Wet canvas sleeves on vibrating pipe runs," it said. "Water-jacketed housings around pump bodies, maintain bleed to avoid air trap. Water-filled baffles against noisy bulkheads, keep fill below 70% for slosh mass. Adjust ballast trim to move prop tips off strongest cavitation band. Shift RPM plus 2 to 3–5% to collapse narrowband harmonic. Repeat tests in C state 3+, and note changes." The sheet went out like contraband. It rode in coat pockets between the pages of deck logs, inside oil-smudged manuals, in the breast pockets of men who could not afford to rearrange the world, but would settle for changing the note it made. Physics does not care about rank. A mass of water, heavy, lazy, and willing, doesn't ask who put it where. It simply sits against a vibrating plate and says, "Give it to me." And some of the energy that would have gone ringing through steel ends up as a slow, fat slosh, a heat you never feel, a movement with the sharp edges worn off. Canvas helps because it wets and holds and gives the water a shape. Hose helps because it keeps the mass from draining away when the ship pitches hard, and because the curved body of a filled hose behaves like a muscle laid along a bone. Cavitation is the ocean's cruel trick. Push a prop fast enough or wrong enough, and you tear vapor pockets from water. Those pockets collapse with tiny hammers that write their pain into the sea. A U-boat's microphones love those hammers. Shift the RPM a little, change the load a little, and the hammer chorus might miss its cue. None of this was a miracle. It was the sort of medicine a working man trusts. Simple, repeatable, something you can point at with a greasy finger and say, "Here, right here." A convoy commodore liked things that fit in one page. He could hand such a thing to a watch officer at Euro 200 and be sure it would be read, not admired. So the rigging guide became a format. Hose lengths, sluice points, safe fill levels, clamps and lashings a ship already had. A line about quiet speed, tables that said in real words what the men had learned by feel. At 135 RPM, with forward ballast tank trimmed +2 inches, prop tone falls under sea state 4 noise floor. The table smelled like cheating. It was only the kind of cheating that keeps men breathing. In the next voyage, you could tell which ships had read the sheet. In the first night leg, the chief engineers trialed Lawson's baffles and sleeves, and by the second night, half the convoy had contraband water clinging to their guts. Radio officers logged bearings that came and went like shy fish. Escort captains grumbled that their own hydrophones now heard more sea and less singing cargo. A destroyer's sonar man said all the convoy sounded like weather. "I can work with that," the Commodore said, and signed an order he never wanted translated into a speech. The U-boat war diary entries that month grew peevish. "Ausfalder Tonleitern," someone wrote, loss of tone ladders, by which he meant the clean harmonic rungs used to climb from a guess to a firing solution. The operators started to doubt themselves. Then they doubted the gear. Bearings that should have crossed to a neat point now crossed to a smear. Torpedoes ran into places where steel had been last night and found only water tonight. A wolfpack commander, salted with experience and impatient with excuses, wrote, "The enemy's convoy discipline has improved because it injured him less than writing. The enemy has taught their ships to stop talking." When a freighter did die, because damped steel is not invulnerable and wolves have noses besides their ears, the sea testified differently. An escort would report a sharp tone rising, a foolish burst of cavitation, a bulkhead that someone had failed to load, and the old, clear song would return just long enough for a U-boat to launch. Then a smear of oil, some wreckage. They still died, just not in the numbers that turn routes into graves. Lawson never wore a medal for it. He wore dishwater, steam burns, and the look men get when they've watched luck turn its face towards them after months of showing them its back. If anyone made him speak, he would not say the idea was brilliant. He would say it was obvious. He would tell you about the way vibration travels in a kitchen, how a chopping block hums against a steel top unless you put a wet towel beneath it, how a pan sitting alone on an iron grate will ring like a cheap bell until you drape a splash of water around it, how a locker door that chatters because its latch is loose will settle like a child if you give it the weight of a bucket on a rope. He would talk as if all of this was only common sense, and he would be right. Common sense is rare. common sense applied under time pressure, with parts at hand, to a problem no one has named for you. That is rarer still. At sea, crews made sport of improving the trick. Some cut baffles with little air pockets in them to keep the slosh active in heavy weather, so the mass would not go dead. Some discovered that a partially filled jacket around a pump body worked like a charm until someone overfilled it and turned the pump into a fish in a barrel. A disaster that taught more than any lecture would. The best crews learned the thing nearly all at once, that you do not silence a ship by stuffing it full of weights. You hush it by tuning where and how it flexes, by giving dangerous notes an easy path to die. A crew that knew this could walk through a hull like doctors and point at points of pain. Here, they'd say, the pipe kisses the frame. Wrap it. Here, the floor plate drinks the pump's stomp. Float this corner and leave that one hard. Here, the prop's tips are too close to the surface at this ballast. Trim her down a hair and get her off the screech. On a black night in February, when sleet turned the deck into a thing you could break a hip on, Lawson found himself beside the rail, listening to the convoy breathe. You could not see the columns, but you felt them, the subtle pushing and pulling of wakes like braided ropes. Something in the water changed, a quiet that held a shape. For the first time since he signed on, the ocean around him felt less like a radio show and more like a crowd whispering in the same key. He did not know the math for it. He knew that if men in boats could make the sea sound like the sea, then other men in other boats would have to work harder to pick them out. He thought of the operator below him in a submarine, a man about his age, thin from hard bread and worry, listening to a world whose edges had been softened, wondering which failure would get him yelled at. He did not hate that man. He pitied him the way one laborer pities another who is having a bad day at the mill. The operational payoff showed up in ugly numbers that got less ugly. Lost contact reports ticked up from almost never to sometimes too often enough that men started to believe in days after tomorrow. Torpedo spreads ran wide. Decoys drew bites. Escorts that once sprinted on clean vectors now sprinted to boxes drawn by probabilities. An escort commander, called upon to explain why his men were spending so much time chasing ghosts, did not throw Lawson under a bus. He said, "The convoy is quieter, and let the rest hang in the air like mist." One ship in a following convoy took a fish in her stern and lived because the boat that shot it had been rushing a doubtful solution. Her medic wrote that the men stumbled under the hit but marveled at what did not come. The second shot placed neat as a drill in the center of the hull. The U-boat had fired blind hope and cursed itself with the reload. By the time it could try again, the escorts were on it, and then it was all pounding, crashing, run deep, run silent, the old dance, and another night where a freighter's name would not be painted on a pier to remember it by. The guide matured in pencil marks. "Canvas sleeve length, longer than you think," one note said. "Keep sleeves wet. Dry canvas talks." Another said, "Pump jackets. Bleed near highest point or airlocks kill the water's weight." Someone added, "Secure baffles low with soft lashings. Stiff ones sing." It became a kind of folklore, precise folklore, the best kind. Deck logs carried engineer marginalia that read like prayers. "Quiet tonight. Held 142 RPM at quiet speed for 5 hours. Bears intermittent. No sharp tones." A radio officer, normally sardonic, wrote that the line of static between escorts and merchantmen had never sounded sweeter. The Commodore, who did not like to write compliments, sent a signal in daylight that said, "Rig as per note. Report anomalies." By note, he meant the same one-pager that had started with a cook's wet rag under a clanging pot. If you need a turning point, take this one. A convoy made a landfall on time, full, minus one straggler that fell to weather, not to wolves. It was not a victory with bunting and bands. It was the kind of victory the Atlantic allows. Arrivals, tallies, signatures, men who had been very cold for a very long time, stepping onto something that was not moving. In a coffee shop with a dirty window, Lawson stirred a cup and felt a shock of embarrassment that anyone might ask him for an explanation in big words. He wanted to tell them that the ocean and the ship were an old marriage, quarrelsome and tender, and that the trick was knowing when to let one lean into the other. He wanted to say that you could spend your life learning the language of things that do not have mouths, and that once you learned, you would know where to put your hand when the noise started up. He did not say any of this. He nodded when a junior engineer thanked him with a cheap cigar and said, "Keep it wet." And they both laughed like men who had seen too much to laugh easily. U-boats changed their habits. They moved closer to the lanes, gambled on periscope shots in poor visibilities, and took risks that made them louder. Escorts sharpened. Air cover grew. Radar improved. There were a dozen reasons the slaughter slowed, and a dozen more why it never really stopped. The wet baffles and sleeves were not the war. They were a fingertip on one of the war's levers, and sometimes a fingertip is what you have. The men who used them became believers because believers live longer than skeptics when faith is cheap and payoff is survival. Word of Lawson's trick reached captains who pretended not to take advice from cooks. They took it anyway, and they kept their pride by saying it out loud like this: "As per engineer's recommendation." Lawson never heard that phrase without grinning. He wanted to tell the engineer that his recommendation wore an apron. On a last cold outbound, with a deck load taped in snow that lifted and blew like sugar, Lawson stood with Murdoch on the catwalk above the engine room, watching his water move. Baffles didn't look heroic. They looked like a row of lazy snakes sleeping against a wall. The sleeves looked like bandages on a wounded giant. The pump jackets looked like something a child would draw. Barrels inside barrels held on with straps. The whole contraption looked field-made because it was. A line blew and sprayed a glitter of water that caught the light for a second before vanishing into vapor. Murdoch tapped the rev counter and kept them in the quiet band. He would have done that even if no one had noticed. It was an engineer's nature to slide away from places where a machine hurt itself. But now there was a reason. "Feels like we're taking things away," he said. "Noise, tones, little bits of what the ship is." Lawson shook his head. "Feels like we're letting her be what she is," he said. "A ship, and not a bell." The convoy steamed into weather that would have shredded nerves even if wolves weren't out there. The escort on the starboard beam signaled adjustments, and the Commodore's ship answered with a wink like a star. In the sound room of a submarine 3 horizons away, a young operator pulled his headphones off and rubbed the red dent they left behind. He cursed the Atlantic for being itself, busy, windy, patternless, and tried to pick the thread again. he found only colors in gray. For an hour he invented ships out of nothing, and then erased them. For a minute he thought he heard a promise of iron and wind, and then lost it when a wave decided to put its mouth over the microphone. He made a mark on the slate, crossed it, and made another. His captain came in, put a hand on the back of his chair, and did not scold. "The ocean has moods," he said. "Tonight it is sulking." The operator nodded, ashamed of his relief. He looked down at the grease pencil. It had a flat side from use, like a token from a world that would never give him what he wanted for free. The end of this story is not fireworks either. It is freight delivered. It is fuel that burns in a ship that will carry men to a beach. It is flour that becomes bread in a town that did not expect to eat this week. It is a convoy where more men argue about coffee than about death. It is a cook who, in a moment of small peace, teaches a younger hand how to quiet a jittering pan with a splash of water, and says, half joking and all serious, "This trick once saved your life." The younger man laughs and rolls his eyes, and then does it and hears the difference, and does not laugh again for a second because he can hear the math between the sounds. There are heroes who are easy to recognize, the ones with medals, the ones with names that show up in books. There are heroes who look like the person who hands you a plate. They touch the world in ways that keep it from hurting you. The ocean is too big to notice every kindness. Some of them stick all the same. Later, after too many voyages to count, after rumors and whispers turned to doctrine and practice, someone tried to put Lawson's idea into the language of evaluation. They wrote that the dampers cut narrowband signature energy by a measured decibel figure. They wrote that quiet speed windows were fleet-dependent and hull-dependent, but reproducible. They wrote that the net effect was a reduction in good U-boat firing solutions and an increase in lost contact events, and they plotted this as dots on paper. Dots are fine. Men lived between the dots. Men slept because their ship's heart stopped tapping a tattoo into the water. Men woke because an attack never came. Men wrote letters because a torpedo fired at a rumor instead of at a line on a plot. Thomas Lawson did not read the evaluation. He read a menu. He cooked to it. He remembered to keep the sleeves wet. He kept the hoses soft, the lashings kinder than wire, the baffles filled but not gluttonous. He told a new engineer, "Don't stiffen everything. Let the ship move the way she wants and bend where she hurts." When the war's tide turned enough that people could stop drowning and look back, they still argued about the big pivots: radar, escort carriers, code-breaking, long-range air patrols. They were right to argue. Those things bent the war's spine. But down among the ribs, where men worked and sweated and did not name themselves, there were smaller bends that mattered to the way breath flowed. A cook's idea was one of them. It did not save the Atlantic. It saved enough. The next time you hear a hollow clang, and then watch someone lay a wet cloth on a piece of metal to stop it, remember that a ship once hid itself behind that gesture. Remember that science is not a laboratory word. It is a way of touching the world and noticing what it does back. Water has hands. Canvas has patience. A ship will keep a secret if you ask it right. Out on the gray deck, a man lit a cigarette out of the wind and thought about the long line of ships behind him, each one now sounding a little less like a bell and a little more like weather. The escort's wakes stitched the dark in neat, purposeful seams. Somewhere ahead, land existed, even if the night did not show it. The cook leaned on the rail until cold bit his knuckles and listened to the sound of everything and nothing. The sea clattered and sighed. The ship answered softly. A gull cried once, foolish and brave. He imagined a room under the ocean where a man took off his headphones, shook his head, and said, "I've lost them." And he hoped the man would find something else to do with his night. He hoped the man would live. He hoped he himself would live, because he had one more idea about a locker door that chattered hard in a following sea, and you never know which mercy will be the one that arrives in time. If you want a clean conclusion, take this. A cook noticed that water is the gentlest hammer in the world. He asked it to strike iron, not to make a note, but to erase one. He tied that hammer to steel with canvas and hose and ordinary nerve. He handed the tool to men who could use it. The Atlantic, hater of neat morals, nevertheless let this one stand. U-boats hunted by ear. For a while, that was how the world worked. Then the world, prompted by a ladle and a splash, learned to hold its breath. That was enough to change the shape of nights. That was enough to let ships pass in the dark, not as bells, but as weather. And in the end, as the convoy made its landfall and harbor lights bruised the low mist with yellow, as lines were thrown and taken, as the engine slowed in kindness to itself, Lawson cleaned his station, stowed his knives, and, out of habit more than hope, laid a wet cloth over the counter where a pan liked to chatter. It fell quiet. He smiled, not because he had won anything, but because the world had listened back. If you were on that ship, you might have felt that the noise in your head eased a little, and that your chest made more room for air. You might have decided to write a letter that began with a small thing. The sea was quiet tonight. And if you were listening from under the sea, you would have heard the honest voice of weather, and then only your own breath. That is a kind of peace, even in war. That is how a cook's insane idea slipped from a galley to a fleet and made the ocean, for a few vital hours at a time, forget how to scream.